Hi, Max Keiser. This is the Keiser Report. Yeah, we started the global insurrection against banker occupation. It takes many names now. Revolutions in Tunis, Cairo, Occupy Wall Street. But it started right here on this show, the global insurrection against banker occupation. Stacy Herbert, tell us more.
Max, in fact, today is Occupy Keiser Report. I am occupying this set today.
To occupy me, where are the handcuffs?
Actually, Max, you have been drudged. Yes, Keiser Report made it to the front page of the Drudge Report. Roseanne Barr, behead bankers, rich who won't give up wealth. Now, I want to point out that this is also a right-wing site that celebrated when a black man was killed in Georgia recently. They whooped it up when a Muslim guy, an American citizen, was assassinated without any due process, no evidence ever even presented.
Yeah, well, those people didn't have the advantage of being white, did they?
And you know, last week we covered Alessio Rastani, who broke through the matrix, broke through the mainstream media, and caused an uproar when he said that Goldman Sachs rules the world. Well, he was invited onto ITV News, and he was there this week. And here's a video of him where he's asked. First, they show this little clip where he says Goldman Sachs rules the world. The audience booed him, and then this is what he says.
If you're thinking that your government's out there, hey, Mr. Cameron, Mr. Obama out there is in control, guess what? They're nothing more than slaves to the capitalist gangbang. That sounds kind of a leftist thing to say, but guess what? That is true.
Yeah, this is fascinating that this Rastani guy on the BBC and British television is simply stating some simple truths about the banking industry, and it's become suddenly a cause celeb, like, oh my gosh, what do we do about these rogue bankers, these banking terrorists? And as if it's something new. But of course, it's the reason why David Cameron is finding it very difficult to manage that country's affairs, along with George Osborne, is because it's been infiltrated by banking terrorists in the city who support him, and he's simply there as a suppository salesman trying to shove up the schwing of the British people lies concocted by the banking industry.
Well, again, going back to Drudge being soft on crime, in America, a gangbang would get you the electric chair in many red states.
That's right, but not in Britain or in America. If you're a gang-banging banker, then you get a reality TV show.
Now, let's move on to Occupy Wall Street, because we have said that one of the shortcomings of this movement is that they haven't targeted towards those responsible, the gangbangers behind it all. I want to show you this little video from Occupy Wall Street, San Francisco.
Jamie Dimon, come out from that lofty tower that you live in that probably costs $40 million. Come on out. I'm going to tell you something, Jamie Dimon, right here, right now, today. You will not get my home.
Yeah, Jamie Dimon. Well, I'd say the time is running out for Jamie Dimon.
Well, the other thing is that she said all she's concerned about is that he doesn't take her house. But the fact is, he will take her house. They will get away with taking all of Americans' properties because they are protected. Now let's turn to this headline, JP Morgan Chase, NYPD, the way forward. So JP Morgan Chase recently donated an unprecedented $4.6 million to the New York City Police Foundation. The gift was the largest in the history of the foundation and will enable the New York City Police Department to strengthen security in the Big Apple.
Well, he's just buying more leg breakers and head crackers to get down there and beat up protesters and children, isn't he?
Well, okay, he's saying it's going to strengthen security in the Big Apple. The Big Apple is the financial center of the United States and therefore the world. Do you see, as this fourth quarter begins, Max, do you see more security in the financial system? Is there more stability in the financial system?
Yes, well, they need more security in Wall Street, especially, let's take a firm like Goldman Sachs, for example. It now looks like they won't be paying their bankers any bonuses at all this year. So Lloyd Blankfein needs security from his own bankers.
Well, but it also, there were many, I saw on Twitter all the bankers and brokers I follow, and they were saying, oh, all the conspiracy theories are going to start up, that Jamie Dimon and JP Morgan paying off the NYPD, it's a big conspiracy, blah, blah, blah. But remember, we covered Leah McGrath Goodman, who wrote The Asylum, the renegades who hijacked the world's oil markets, and she said in no uncertain terms, on the NYMEX, there is wide-scale drug dealing happening there, and that because they pay the New York City Police Department so much, they never ever look for drugs there.
Of course not. That's another truism on Wall Street. New York Times wrote a story when I was working there in the 80s speculating that 98% of the people working on Wall Street were either trafficking or doing cocaine. That hasn't changed at all.
But again, this mocking, this cynicism, this ridiculing by the likes of Drudge, by the likes of Bill Maher across the culture in America, where it's okay to assassinate a U.S. citizen because he's obviously a bad guy because the president doesn't like him, or that this is okay for J.P. Morgan, a private corporation, to pay your police department a huge sum of money, the largest in the history of New York. This is something that we saw in the Mubarak regime.
That's right. Mubarak tried the same thing. Simply hired more leg breakers. It didn't really help in the end.
No, but again, Max, this notion that there's some sort of exceptionalism and that we can, dance at the edge of tyranny and not ever, for some reason, because we're superior Americans, fall over into a corrupt system.
Where's Madonna? Dancing on the edge of tyranny. That sounds like a dance hit if I ever heard one.
So again, okay, here's JP Morgan, and when we're told by all our fellow Americans, don't worry about them paying off the New York Police Department. Here's another headline regarding JP Morgan. The Anglo-American Precious Metals Derivatives Duopoly, quarterly OCC report. So this is from the U.S. Office of Currency Comptroller, and they've just issued their quarterly report on the derivatives exposure of U.S. banks and trusts. And lo and behold, the report shows that JP Morgan has about 80% of the gold derivatives. The other 20% is held by HSBC.
Yeah, they manipulate that market. And it's been proven over and over and over again. And anytime they get into a court of law, they claim that it's for national security that they need to manipulate these markets. And meanwhile, capitalism and economics in America is crashing on the rocks and turning into a huge embarrassment for everyone who lives there. This is why many people are trying to get out.
And again, bringing this back to JP Morgan and Occupy Wall Street and the cultural zeitgeist in America, Michael Moore famously said, we need to end capitalism as they're outside of Occupy Wall Street. But is this capitalism that one of the most important markets in the world, one of the most important currency markets in the world, gold, is controlled by two entities? 100% of all the derivatives are controlled by two entities.
Yeah, well, and why do they control gold and silver? Why do they monopolize gold and silver? Why do they have all of the buys and the sells on these markets and manipulate these prices every single day? Because the axiomatic flip side of gold and silver is the U.S. dollar. And to have the U.S. dollar as world reserve currency, which is the foundation of the American Ponzi scheme, which gives America the right to charge rent from 6 billion humans on planet Earth as part of their soft empire, requires dollar fiat currency printing willy-nilly and for the price of gold and silver to remain oppressed. This is the true battle, because as the American empire collapses, due to their own stupidity, mind you, not because it's simply the time for them to go away, they're just shooting themselves in the head. Gold and silver vigilantes are saying, okay, well, it's a new era, a new century. We got to take gold up to $5,000, $6,000, $7,000 an ounce and see who out there wants to compete, who wants to be a world leader. Not America. They've abdicated that position. They just want to rely on, pork rinds and cheap guns and Walmart, Burger King, whacking homeless people sloshing about on food stamps looking for some crack pipe. That's all they got. So who else can take over?
Well, the report also notes that JP Morgan's derivatives outstanding now stands at a notional $78 trillion.
$78 trillion. This is what JP Morgan has in derivatives.
Yes.
The total global GDP is approximately $50 trillion. So this one bank controls more derivatives than the entire globe's GDP. Why do they do that? They need that amount of firepower to keep prices manipulated. There are the prices you see quoted every day on CNBC. Those are the prices that JP Morgan and Goldman Sachs allow to be printed. Those are not derived from price discovery from free market buys and sells. Those are propaganda, American style. They print prices that they produce through American version of Pravda, CNBC. And from there, they take it straight down into the gutter.
Well, for those who are going to try to press the propaganda that, oh, these are just notional values and it's all hedged and it's netted out, of course, the counterparty risk, as we saw with AIG or Lehman Brothers, it could disappear like that.
The counterparty risk is austerity measures in Greece, all over Europe, all over the world. That's the hedge against abuse in the derivative markets. And this is what's driving the global insurrection against banker occupation. This is what's driving fiat money to the curb. This is what's driving the move to gold and silver. This is why Jamie Dimon has to hire cops to protect him against his own bankers who are not getting bonuses because he's a frickin' pig.
And then finally on this, so we're talking about these giant amounts of 78 trillion in derivatives that JP Morgan has, and that's just one of the banks. They're the biggest in terms of how much derivatives exposure they have. But it's very hard to get that through to the people out on Occupy Wall Street or Occupy America, all across America. They're more focused on little things because these numbers are just so big. Headline from the FT reads, why 14,000 billion no longer scares us. So this is Gillian Tett, and she's saying that money has basically gone virtual because there's so much of it. So our brains are no longer able to even compute these numbers.
Or you could say that money has become completely plasticine and able to be shaped by propaganda meisters. And that's what we're talking about. In the old days, they used to shape the news, and they used to flood the news with lies and counterfeit the truth by counterfeiting lies and just lying 24 hours a day. This would create a new normal that people would have to adjust to, and that's the secret of propaganda from the old days. Now they just issue billions and billions of mispricing non-existing securities, and they use that ticker tape of lies, of propaganda, financial propaganda, to say oil's doing this, or the dollar's doing that, or the metals are doing something else, then drawing conclusions based on lies to legitimize their policies that at the end of the day only accomplish two things: make the top 1% richer and make everyone else suffer austerity.
She notes one fascinating cultural twist of this money meaning nothing. She said that it deals with the funds that deal with ETFs handling gold have now installed webcams in their vaults to prove that these funds are backed by tangible bullion. Investors, it seems, want to watch those gold bars. They don't trust the idea of zeros flying about in cyberspace.
That's a lie too.
Like you can't fake gold bars sitting in a vault.
Oh boy. All right, Stacy Herbert, thanks so much for being on the Keiser Report.
Thank you, Max.
Don't go away, much more coming away, so stay right there. Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. What a treat. This is the book. If you don't have this book already, you've got to get this book. The author, Satyajit Das, is with us here. Well, welcome to the Keiser Report.
It's very nice to be with you. Nice of you to ask me.
All right, so this is the book, Extreme Money. And it's a fantastic book because a lot of people say, the problem is you've got all these weapons of mass financial destruction. But that's a very obtuse phrase. They're not sure what that means. And yet here is a multiple 100-page book that describes exactly this. Is it not the financialization of everything has created this bizarro world of extreme money?
I think you've got to go back in time. Money used to be something really simple. It was basically a mechanism for exchange. You know, you wanted me to do something for you, paid me. I wanted you to do something, I paid you. Second thing was a store of value. So I saved, put the money away, could consume at a future date. Somewhere in the 70s, in the early 80s, it went completely haywire.
Right, but we know what happened in the 70s. The Black-Scholes option pricing formula came around. The option pricing formula for volatility was invented so that risk or volatility could be traded separately from reward, so to speak. That they kind of split the atom of capitalism. Where am I wrong in that thinking?
I think you're right, but I think the risk comes second. There's the first part. Once you stripped money away from this idea of real things, what it became was like a strange world which went round and round and round and round. I'll give you a very good example of that. If you take CDOs, collateralized debt obligations, the most interesting thing about them was by, say, 2005, you were using that to buy, not real things, you were using debt to buy other debt, which then bought other debt, and it just kept going down the chain. But the second part, you've hit the nail on the head. The second part of financialization was interesting, it was risk. Now, originally, when you had risk, it was kind of simple, but somewhere in there, people found a way to effectively strip it apart and trade it. Now, I believe greatly in what I call the law of conservation of risk, which is risk cannot be lost. All you can do is shuffle it around and give it to somebody else. The point here is some people might be able to bear the risk better because they've got offsetting positions. But what Black-Scholes does, and the key to understanding Black-Scholes, the whole option pricing framework, is we now understand risk, and more importantly, we can dynamically hedge it. So banks and everybody else get into the idea that we understand risk, we know exactly what it is, and we can lay it off and hedge it. And that insight about risk created this cult that we actually got rid of uncertainty. We could make things certain. And everything in finance was now driven by more and more debt, because if you don't have uncertainty, then you can take on more debt, because the problem of not paying it back goes away to some degree. And that was the key.
Now, you said something very interesting, the conservation of debt and hedging. Now, people are curious why this wealth and income gap keeps spreading more and more. Can we say that those who are controlling the capital, they are creating the volatility, and yet they're completely hedged? But the crashing markets, the policy reactions, the panicked policy reactions end up where the masses are being asked to absorb the austerity.
All bankers are capitalists when they're making money. The moment they lose money, they become socialists and line up with their tin cups along with everybody else, get the taxpayer to pay. But you've hit the nail on the head in terms of a very interesting interaction between the average person and finance. Now, everybody has conspiracy theories. Everybody assumes in a dark room somewhere people sat down and plotted this out down to the last T. It wasn't. It was accidental. A whole series of things fell into line. And while these developments in risk were going on, parallel to that, there was a problem, which is in income inequality. People were getting poorer. So what did we do when people got poorer? We basically democratized credit and said, hey, you want that car? You may not earn enough, but we'll lend you the money. And that led down this path of basically creating income inequality. And there is a social element to this. It's about slavery. Because you can make people slaves in different ways. One is once you get them to borrow and they owe you money, they become slaves as well. So there's a bunch of people, financiers now, were propelled into the center stage of all of this, where they control this entire process, purely accidentally. But the one thing about financiers is they're smart. When they see something which has advantages, they take advantage of it. So they propel themselves into the centerpiece. The other thing that you mentioned, which I think is really fascinating about the whole period of history, is what was really going on is a reaction to a whole bunch of things. Like, for instance, in the 1970s, we had stagflation. Keynesian mixed economy wasn't working, so people said, well, what can we try? Let's try a bit of deregulation. Nobody actually knows whether it worked or not. I mean, Ronald Reagan is the beatified, a person on the far right, except he ran the biggest deficits up till that point in time. People forget that. On the other side, Bill Clinton is supposed to be left of center, yet he ran the most right-of-center financial policies known to mankind. So there was just mixture. So essentially we had this dilutive process where political ideology became unhinged because nobody really knew what to do. And the financiers said, hey, efficient markets and we are the answer. So they were able to almost combine political power, economic power, financial power in this one person, which of course now we know has backfired.
Talking about this historically over the past few decades and since the creation of the modern derivative era. Now, after options and listed options, Chicago Board of Options Exchange, were created, you had a few years of high-level inflation.
Yes.
Paul Volcker came in. He raised interest rates to
18%. It peaked at LIBOR. Prime peaked at 21. I remember the day.
And it peaked around 1980. And then Reagan came in. Now, from 1980 until very recently, you've had the longest bond market rally in the history. Sure. So the people who, for 20, 30 years, who have become debt slaves, but they did so on the back of a rising bond market or lowering interest rates.
Absolutely
So
correct.
they were unaware of the fact that even though they were spending lots of money and they were taking loans out against their house, they were actually going broke. Then suddenly, 2 or 3 years ago, the party ended. Suddenly, houses are underwater.
Correct.
Suddenly, people are now finding themselves as debt slaves. But this was not something that just happened.
No. It's taken 30, 40 years. But the point you make is interesting. There's nothing wrong with debt per se. Debt assumes a couple of very important things. Firstly, what you've bought with it produces income. So basically you have the income to pay back the interest and the principal. But also what you have is whatever you bought with the debt keeps its value. Now, you hit the nail on the head. Houses were the key thing here. And when houses fall in value, you were never going to earn anything. Your principal resident isn't actually a source of income. So basically, you were never going to pay it back.
Right. In fact, it was negative income because of all the subsidies.
Absolutely. And all the subsidies gradually are unaffordable now. So under those circumstances, you get into problems.
What do you make of the current interest rate policy of Federal Reserve banks around the world? Zero interest rate policy. It seems forced. Quantitative easing, 1, 2. Forced. Keeping interest rates artificially low. Isn't it just perpetuating the Ponzi?
Well, they are to some degree, but the Ponzi now is the government's, because the governments actually took over the debt from the private sector because they had to through the banking system when the banking system became literally insolvent. And now what we're seeing is a concerted effort by the central banks to keep interest rates low because they know, for instance, take Japan. It's got 200% debt to GDP, though that's gross debt, not net. But if you push up interest rates from 1% to 3%, well, Japan basically goes out the back door quicker than you can blink. So everybody actually has to keep interest rates. Now, the most interesting recent example is Ben Bernanke and the twist. But basically what he's doing is pulling down the long end of the curve. He's saying all sorts of things like mortgage refinancing. Got nothing to do with mortgage refinancing. He wants to create greater capacity for the federal government to basically spend more money.
I want to stick on this Fed thing for a second because the Fed under Greenspan and now with Bernanke has been completely politicized. And yet they're supposed to be independent. Occupy Wall Street is now beginning to be protest against the Fed. First they realized, you know what, it's not politics, it's the bankers. And then they realized, you know, who's behind the bankers? It's the Fed bankers. And they're moving in that direction. And you've got a big uptick in Ron Paul, who's made this an issue.
Absolutely.
So they're not independent. It's become politicized, and yet they say they're independent. So how do we rectify that problem?
Well, I think firstly you've got to break the finance-government complex. You've got to break that. Same as the defense-industrial complex from the 1950s. You've got to break that, which is you've got to change campaign finance. You've got to basically look at the banks and make sure the banks can't influence politicians in the way they do. You've got to cut out all the lobbying, the heavily financed lobbying, which actually weakens all the legislation. And the other thing is, I'm not sure that you want an entirely independent Federal Reserve Board anyway, but you want one which makes decisions purely on the economics of the case, not on the politics of the case. And the crucial thing was Greenspan. You're absolutely correct. Because Greenspan, more than anybody, politicized the process because he was basically, at the end of the day, a political person because he was a very poor economist. Everybody agrees that he was a very poor economist. And he basically knew how to keep the bankers happy. His constituency was always the bankers. From 87 onwards, every time the banks had a problem, he cut interest rates, he flooded the system with money. And that created this huge debt burden to a large degree. So you can't get off that. But I think you've got to break that nexus. I agree with that. The interesting thing, I was thinking of the Wall Street protest. Perhaps Rick Perry would like to go down there and join them. Because remember, he was the one railing about the fact that the Fed was basically should be tried for treason. Bernanke should be tried for treason. So perhaps he should lead the charge in that regard.
Well, there has been a lot of chatter along those lines. Is there a role for a Federal Reserve Bank? It's a relatively, in America, of course, it was started as a way to get away from the Bank of England. Ben Franklin made this case. You know, one of the reasons we started America was to get rid of the Bank of England, get away from them.
And it was created by Germans, strangely enough, by Paul Warburg.
And when they introduced it in 1913, they brought in the income tax.
That's right.
Okay, so now, is there a case for a Federal Reserve Bank at all?
I suspect you would need it because in modern monetary economics, you cannot get away from a central bank. Somebody has to print money, somebody has to control the money supply, somebody has to control the debt issues.
But if you look at a state like North Dakota in America, the state owns the bank, they have a very tight control on the money supply, and they didn't have any of these banking problems.
Which is going back to Hayek and basically saying you have a rule-based system where you're basically saying, look, there's a series of rules, you just follow the rules. In which case it's a mechanical process. You need a mechanical process of doing that rather than a bank itself because there's no decision-making. So you're going to a Hayek solution to some degree. And that's possible.
Okay, so the bank becomes basically a utility. Now, the argument against it is that, well, with these investment banks and they have so much money floating through the system, you're feeding the entrepreneurial economy, you're feeding NASDAQ, you're feeding the loans, you're feeding risk-taking. So there's the give and take right there. However, what we're saying, is there a way to get out of this conundrum that the Fed finds itself in? They've got more debt on their books than they can possibly grow their way out of. They're going to have to do something radical. Is there any solution that's going to be less than a radical, very painful solution?
No. The answer is no. Otherwise, you lock yourself into a Japan-like solution of 20 years of nothing, where you basically try to grind out, and Japan still can't get out the other side, simply because there is no answer through debt deflation under those circumstances, because that's what they've locked themselves into. To break the nexus in some way, I mean, there are other solutions as well, which are equally radical. Why don't you withdraw all the money supply completely and replace it with notes which have to be spent within 2 years?
Right. So you have a time value on your notes.
Correct.
Right. So you, which under an internet-based, technology-driven society,
it's very easy to do.
So you contact Groupon. And I have a question for you. Why, with Groupon,
Yep.
of course, people are crazy about getting group discounts on sushi
yeah.
or nail polishing. But if you tell them, you know what, we're going to create a nationwide Groupon and get a discount on healthcare,
Yeah.
they say, no, that's socialism.
Well, basically, nail care and socialism don't go together as healthcare and socialism do. I've never understood the American psyche. I mean, I have completely rational friends who, the moment we raise the issue of healthcare, accuse me of being a communist. which is
Right,
quite
without any
strange.
discussion.
Without any discussion. And I never really understand that sort of jump in the logic. So it's a
no.
bit like that. Groupon is exactly the same. As you say, it's a form of socialism to some degree.
Das, thanks so much for being on the Keiser Report.
Nice to be with you.
All right, and that's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacy Herbert. If you want to buy this book, I suggest you do so by our good buddy Das. If you want to send me an email, please do so at keiserreport@rttv.ru. Until next time, this is Max Keiser saying bye, y'all.